Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Tim, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name is Tim Smith. I've been looking into the Kennedy assassination. I think it really took a serious turn for me on March 6th, 1975, a Thursday night, when they showed the Zapruder film on Goodnight America with Geraldo Rivera. I had read a few things before that. I was 7 years old when it happened, so I do remember it. My mother collected all types of newspapers, and that kind of got me going. But I was 7 years old. I wasn't exactly at the National Archives at 8 and 9. But time went by, and I lived in a small town. They had a few books, and so I would look at those. But on that Thursday night in March, a couple of friends were over to my house. I think I recount this in the book, or at least I mentioned it. And we were all kind of into it, and we couldn't believe what we were seeing because at that point we were told, shot from the rear, but it certainly didn't look like it was a shot from the rear. And one of those guys pretty much dropped it after that. He just lost interest. One a little bit. I was the only one that really kind of kept things going. So I've been going off and on fairly steady since, I'd say the mid 70s. I was fortunate enough to speak at WEC 2003. And that was a lot of fun. Met a lot of people that I knew of, interacted with them a little bit. That was fun. And I've given hundreds of talks at local libraries and things like that. So a couple of years ago, I decided that I just want to put down my thoughts on the HSCA, which originally the book was my master's thesis. And it was only about 120 pages. And so the book, I think, was like 565 pages or something like that. But what I wanted to do was create a guide, because I knew that there were a lot of people that the HSCA had interviewed, but only 52 gave public testimony in September. And then there was a kind of a tag on at the end of December. And I used that as a platform to present the evidence, which is exactly what Blakey told me when I interviewed him in 1998, when he was still teaching law at Notre Dame at the time. And I went down there and interviewed him, and I asked him, I said, why these 52? What was your point? Because you interviewed hundreds of people. He says that was our way of presenting the evidence to the American public, and they were on PBS. All these interviews that they had with the 52 witnesses. But I also did not want to just end it with those 52 witnesses, because if that's all I do, then that's the evidence through 1978, and a lot has happened since then. So I use that as a platform to analyze their evidence, but also bring it as up to date as I possibly could, whether it was the acoustics, whether it was neutron activation analysis. I wanted to bring it up to date, at least to the year 2022, as best I could. So that was my motivation behind the book. And no one was doing anything with the HSCA. They still haven't done a whole lot with the HSCA, as you're well aware. Gate and Fonzie's both the last investigation. That was more of the inner workings of the HSCA as much as it was analyzing what they said, though there is some of that in there. And Gate and Fonzie was a great investigator. So that was my motivation behind it. I'm actually considering, this is just a quick sidebar, doing that with the Bobby Kennedy assassination, taking the pantry witnesses and using them as kind of a platform to lead to other things.
I'll help you out with that. Greg Ciccone, he did the Dealey Plaza witness map, but he's now doing one on the RFK assassination. Plotting every single witness. But I can connect you with him. He'll be able to help you out.
That would be a gold mine. Absolutely. I've also considered doing a guide to the people who testified at the Shaw trial. Nobody's done anything like that with that. So I try to do things that nobody else has done instead of just repeating the same old, same old. But the HSCA was a lot of fun to do. I contacted as many witnesses as I could who were still alive, and reached out to them. Some were cooperative, some like Ida Dox. We can talk about that later on. The first time I talked to Ida Dox, she hung the phone up on me. She said, "Don't you ever call me again." Okay, so I waited 2 weeks and I called her again. And I told her, "So I'm not trying to annoy you. I'm really not." That whole thing. Well, I'll say that for later. There's a lot of stories behind the Ida Dox thing.
Why do you think the HSCA is so polarized when it comes to being discussed in the JFK community? It seems like people either don't want to touch it or they consider it just like the worst investigation or something that was already like government bunked and funded, which look, there's a lot of government people on there. It probably shouldn't have been like that. And they were really under some time pressures and other constraints as well, too. But they come up with this number, 400 and something. And out of the 52 that they used, I don't know how they came up with that number. Me and Craig actually talked about it where he was like, I don't see that many people in at least the photographs or anything like that. So how can they tell unless people started coming out and speaking forward? And they don't really give reference to those 488 to where that number came from. It's kind of like it got pulled out of thin air. I mean, the Warren Commission stated one number, HSCA stated a little bit of a different number, and then we only have the people that are interviewed to go off of. So then there's this
Actually,
massive.
the Warren Commission was 488. That's where that number comes from.
So the HSCA is how many?
52 that testified publicly, but they interviewed hundreds of people.
Like,
And I asked Blakey about that. Blakey says, I chose those 52 for two reasons. I wanted to present a scientific evaluation of the evidence. And he said, I thought those were the best to represent them. And they kind of come in clusters. They do the medical, they'll do the acoustics, they'll do the FBI, the Secret Service. So you can see, if you look at it, obviously these are put together for a reason. Blakey did tell me, however, there were some that he regrets putting on of those 52, and some that he really wished that he told me that he wished he would have had what's his name, the famous pitcher, Bill and Gail Newman. He wished he would have interviewed them and asked them. He said, but he didn't. And he said he wished he wouldn't have interviewed Jack White. He thought that was just an embarrassment. So that he had kind of back and forth on some. He said overall he was happy with what happened. But that was the motivation of why he picked those 52. He wanted to have a scientific approach to the evidence.
why? What was he basing his scientific approach towards?
I think the reason he said that was that he did not. I think he looked at the Warren Commission, and I don't say this with a lot of certitude, but I always got the impression, because I interviewed him for a couple hours in his office down in Notre Dame. I live about 45 minutes from Notre Dame, so it was easy. And he was very, as he was when you interviewed him, he's just very folksy. He's charming. He was just very laid back. And he told me, he says, I did not want a bunch of cornflakes in the hamburger. I wanted as best as we could, be as precise as we could. Here's the evidence, and here's why we believe what we believe, whether it's ballistics, photographic, or whatever it was. Overall, I think he was pleased with it. I would have maybe some minor disagreements, but I think the community, I don't know why, in a way, the community is so divided on the HSCA. I've never really understood it. To me, it was, we learned things from them we didn't know. So I think that's a good thing. I think there were steps made forward. Although as I was rereading the witnesses when I was writing my book, it was obvious the fix was in on so many occasions. I mean, just out of the blue, they bring in this guy, Anthony Pellicano, to deliver some paper about the acoustics. Well, what is that about? I mean, you didn't do that with anything else. So it's almost like they really pushed back on things that were going to go against what the Warren Commission said. And that was a little disappointing. So yeah, I mean, they have their pros and cons, to be sure.
What about certain members of the HSCA that had dissenting views? I mean, I didn't know about this, but Henry Gonzalez, he originally campaigned to get Richard Sprague taken off, and then nobody took Richard Sprague off. I think Richard Sprague either just resigned or something like that.
No, they forced Richard Sprague out, no question about that. And
he would have done a better job than Blakey, in my opinion.
I agree with that. I agree with that, absolutely. And Gonzalez, he didn't make the final cut either, as far as I know.
But he mentions in a letter to someone where he states that he did have pictures of, because he was at Parkland and everything. He took pictures. He said they were very like just the president covered in a sheet, nothing like super conspiracy, anything that would be different than anything that would reveal anything at least. And he had his camera stolen out of his car. And in his letter, he specifically talks about, I remember locking my car, going inside, coming back out, my car was unlocked and my cameras were gone, and the film was gone when he eventually got his cameras back. And then he states at the ending of it, of the letter, he states that, I think that we've never had an investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I think all the documents should be open to the public. Now, everybody should agree on that last part, but that part before that, I'm wondering how many members had dissent about what was going on with the HSCA's investigation, whether it was the time crunch, whether it was just where they were looking.
Well, one of the things that I put in my book is a letter from Thomas Canning, who really objected to the way that Blakey handled things, in the sense that everyone was partitioned off against everyone else. In other words, the photographic panel could not talk to the medical panel. The medical panel could, I mean, which to me is ridiculous. Why aren't you sharing information? Why aren't you bouncing ideas off you? But absolutely, they were forbidden to do that, and Canning objected to that. That's why I put that letter in the book, because I thought, that's kind of an important issue. Maybe who knows what they could have discovered had they not done something that ridiculous. So, I mean, on the medical panel, the only one who dissented was Cyril Wecht. The other ones agreed 100% with each other, and that I think that's telling. Whether it was the medical panel or whatever panel you want to pick, because usually what happens, someone would speak on behalf of the panel. So, for example, if someone is talking, you can rest assured he was on a panel of about 4 or 5 or 6 other people, but someone had to be chosen to present the evidence publicly. And that, like, for example, Dr. Michael Baden, he represented the medical panel, although other people were interviewed publicly too, but he was really the go-to guy for that. And yet, the one thing the HSCA, although they did not put this in the report, I wish they would have, because I have an old VHS tape of Baden and Cyril Wecht, who were good friends after the fact. They were talking at a conference in Washington, D.C., and they looked at us and said, oh, yeah, we all agreed. Everybody agreed, even though 8 of the 9 forensic pathologists did not believe in the conspiracy and believed in the single bullet theory, Wecht being the only dissenter. But they all agreed on this. So says Wecht and Baden, I'm sorry, at the conference, that the back wound was rising at 11 degrees. And I'm thinking, the first time I heard that, I thought, what did he just say? The back wound is rising. It's because the Warren Commission had it descending at 45 degrees. So what is up with that? Because if that's true, if that back wound is seriously rising, and they all agreed on that based on the abrasion collar around the wound, then that means the game is over. At that point, I don't care who you put in that 6th floor window, you're shooting someone downward at 60 degrees, unless he's tying his tennis shoes, that bullet is not going to be rising at 11 degrees. And yet it is rising at 11 degrees, although it was never put in the report or in any of the volumes. And that was a little discouraging. But I asked Baden to his face. We all ate at Cyril Wecht's house the Saturday night when I spoke at the conference in 2003 in Pittsburgh. And I asked Wecht and I asked Baden both, did I understand you correctly when you said the wound is rising at 11 degrees and JFK back? They said yes. Now, Baden's going to differ from Wecht. He said, well, JFK was bending over, to which I said to Baden, with all due respect, no, he's not. We have the films, we have the photographs. He is sitting upright in a supine position. He is not bending over at all. But Baden has to have him bending over to make the single bullet theory work. Wecht doesn't, because Wecht doesn't believe in the single bullet theory. But the fact of the matter is, look at the evidence, which you've seen the photographs as much as I have. He's not bending over. His back is against the back seat. So when Baden says that, I'm thinking, you know better than that. What are you doing here? It's just ridiculous. And at that point, that's when you realize, okay, the fix is in. He's not going to change no matter what. Go ahead.
I was about to say, do you trust the acoustics? Both on the conspiracy side and the lone nut side kind of seem to not want to rub their hands with that. But to me, everything that challenges the single bullet theory, the HSCA would either introduce, and then something would happen to it that would either keep the single bullet theory intact. Like either evidence, like you just mentioned, that wasn't going in the report, or something where it comes to the acoustics where it gets debunked because of a motorcycle cop left his microphone on and you don't really know how many shots, where the single bullet theory is still intact. The only thing I've seen challenge it was the bullet that was found by Paul Landis, which he said way back in the day too, but there's still like discrepancies with Tomlinson and all that goes back and forth.
Yeah, Paul Landis' story is the exact same story that Sam Kinney had years ago. And I mean, really, what are the odds? I mean, just come on. What are the odds that a bullet's just be lying there after it did all that stuff? What bullet is Landis even saying that is? Is he saying that is the single bullet from the single bullet theory? Because if that's what he's saying, that is ludicrous beyond description.
It was next to a stethoscope. That's what he said.
It's almost like nowadays, if you don't have a catch in your book, you're not going to get it published by anybody of any reputable sort at all. You have to have some. I mean, even Wesley Buell Frazier's book, I think it's called Steering Right or something like that. Even in that book, I've met Frazier at conferences. I've talked with him. I've heard him give the same story over and over. He seems like a nice, decent guy. But now in his book, he has something different, because that's going to make the book sell as well. I saw this guy and I saw him holding the rifle And like, where did that come from? Why are you just saying that now? Usually, when someone says things that Johnny come lately approach, that's troublesome to me. Because why didn't you say it earlier? You were saying everything else earlier. Why did you? It just seems odd to me. So, yeah, the do I trust the acoustics? Absolutely. I've had many conversations with Don Thomas over the years. Read his book, listened to his podcast, his interview with you, which I thought he did a really good job. You guys had a really good interaction there. I do. I think those. I think what convinced me, even though I was pretty convinced about the acoustics already, when I read Josiah Thompson's sequel to 6 Seconds in Dallas called Last Second in Dallas, he went back and sat down with James Barger and they redid the whole acoustic stuff. And I think it's more solid now than it's ever been. I think they did five spikes in the acoustics. And these guys were good. The problem with something like the National Academy of Sciences in 1982 who tried to debunk it, they had no acoustical experts. Sorry. If you're going to talk about acoustics, I'd like to have someone who is an acoustics expert. And Barger is, the Acoustical Society of America. They were highly touted. He did the Kent State shooting. He was so accurate on Kent State that they pinpointed the spot where the guy actually shot his rifle at the Kent State students. And they approached him and says, our evidence indicates you were standing right here. And the guy caved. He says, yeah, that's exactly where I was standing. You're right. I mean, they're good. I'm not saying that they're 100% perfect because I'm sure there are variables to consider, but yeah, I do buy into the acoustics. When someone says, well, I've listened to those tapes and you can't hear it. Of course you can't hear it. I mean, because they're voice grained, just like your cell phone. And, Don Thomas talked about that with you. So to say I can't hear it is it's just nonsense. You shouldn't be able to hear it. That's the point.
What do you think the biggest problem for the HSCA was?
I think the biggest problem for the HSCA was at the end of the day, they did not want to let Oswald go. And that's what Blakey told me. Blakey to this day, as far as I know, unless he's changed in the last month or so, still believes in the single bullet theory. He still believes that for the most part, Oswald was the lead shooting, and he was the shooter that day in the 6th floor window. He says there was a shot from the grassy knoll, but it missed everything. I mean, okay. To say the shot made it from that 6th floor window, but the shot from the grassy knoll missed, is that possible? Well, anything's possible, sure. Highly unlikely. That I think whoever was shooting that day were serious professional assassins, and those people don't miss. The shot from the window, you always hear people say, and I've heard, Joe Rogan say it on his podcast. And I like to listen to Joe Rogan talk about it. He's a seasoned hunter. So I want to listen to what he has to say about rifles and that. And he said that, well, no, it really wasn't that tough of a shot, to which I would say to Joe Rogan, I agree. I don't think it was a tough shot for Joe Rogan in the 21st century with a modern rifle. But what people forget is that Oswald was not Joe Rogan. He was using a rifle that was made in 1891. They stopped making it in 1941. This thing was absolute junk. When the FBI tested it, they had to put it in vice grips to shoot it because they were afraid the thing was going to explode. And when they did, it shot high into the right from 15 yards away. Well, that car was moving right to left. The rifle shoots left to right, and that's put in a vice grip and pulling the trigger. Oswald was at best, to quote Lieutenant Colonel Folsom before the Warren Commission, he said he was a rather poor shot. And understand, Oswald's using what, an M14 and M16 at the rifle range under good conditions with a lot of practice, and he's shooting a 191. That's not a good shot. So, but that day he just becomes Superman on the 6th floor window and he turns into Deadeye Dick, it's absurd. There's nothing that really links that rifle to Oswald, by the way. I mean, nothing except, his phony name on it, Alex Heidel. But that is a can of worms. When you go down that road, that's a nightmare, I think, for the lone nut people. I really do. But having said that, I mean, you interviewed Posner, you've interviewed Dale Myers, you've interviewed Blakey. I mean, and I would agree when I listened to Posner's discussion with you, my attitude about that seemed like a really nice conversation they were having. You challenged him, which that's kind of your job. But yeah, okay. So I think the problem is if we go into this thing, and I don't believe in the lone nut, I believe there was conspiracy. But if I go into this with talking about the evidence with people, trying to make every absolute piece of evidence look conspiratorial, I'll make a fool of myself. But it just won't work. But I would say I don't need that. I think there's enough evidence for me to suggest a conspiracy that I don't need to try to connect every single dot in this case, because it's a waste of time anyway. It won't work. And I just don't have a desire to. I'm like you, Robbie. I like to have discussions with people. I like to talk with people. I'm not out trying to make disciples. That I have no interest in doing that. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, the HSCA's problem, they were too wedded to Oswald, and they just did not want to let it go, because at the end of the day, the only difference between the Warren Commission and the HSCA is the acoustics at the end of the day. And I don't see how you fit Oswald into that.
When I had my discussion with Posner and I showed him the HSCA, I think it was from one of their volumes, but it was an interview with Marina, and she stated she couldn't recognize the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. But then in the Warren Commission, she clearly identified Oswald's rifle when it was shown to her. And when I showed Posner that, he just didn't have a response. Like nobody wants to touch the HSCA. I'm like, that's our latest investigation government wise, and they proved a probable conspiracy. You're not going off the first information. We need to go off the latest information, the reinvestigation, the last one that was conducted.
I agree, 100%. Yeah, the Marina Oswald testimony was frustrating at best. I, in the 90s, talked to her 3 times on the telephone, talking to her about the backyard photographs. And I said to her, I said, Marina, you realize that people are saying your testimony at times is all over the place. You've changed your mind. And she said, one of the reasons for that may be that I'm just not as interested in all the weeds she didn't say the word weeds, but that's what she was saying, as everyone else is. She goes, I was living with the guy. I wasn't thinking every day when I was with him, oh, I need to pay attention to that point, to that point, to that point. When you read her testimony before the HSC, oh my gosh, her most line that she says is, I don't know, or I can't remember. Constantly, don't know, can't remember, don't know, can't remember. And when she's challenged about that, and they actually read before to her things that seem to be contradictory, she says, I'm sorry, I just don't remember. Is she lying? I don't know. She doesn't seem like she is to me, but that's a psychological statement, not a factual statement. I don't know if Marina's lying. I would have no desire to talk to Marina Oswald today, even if I could, except maybe to be folksy, hi, how you doing? Because she's not going to change her story. Tim Smith's not going to call her. She's going to, oh my God, that's Tim Smith on the phone. Good. Now the day is I spill my guts. It's not going to happen, but she's a savvy gal, I'll tell you that. I mean, you see her interview with is it Larry Howard? And she's being interviewed by, I think, Brokaw, if I'm not mistaken. And she's feisty. She goes toe to toe with the guy. So, but I think there just came to a point. She said, "I'm done. I'm not." Marina, I haven't checked, but she's got to be in her early 80s. Still living outside of Dallas, on a farm, bought for her and her second husband, Ken Porter. The Annenberg Foundation bought that for them. And I've heard people say, well, Ken Porter, he's CIA. Well, okay, you can say anything you want, but I need to see a document. I need to see something to indicate that Ken Porter is CIA more than Ken Porter CIA. So, yeah, Marina's a mystery. She always will be. She'll die a mystery. She's not going to say anything different than she's ever said. So what that means, was she an agent? Was she, was plotted to come over here? I don't know. Anything we say is going to be a guess on that. I don't know. I've always just kind of felt kind of bad for her, to be honest with you. I mean, she didn't know any English at all. I mean, that's why when she testifies for the Warren Commission, there is, what was the translator's name? I think it was Ilya Mammontov, if I'm not mistaken. She was Marina's translator. Now, she can speak English well enough that she does testify for the HSCA. Without a translator. Her lawyer's there, Mr. Hamilton, but she didn't need a translator that I remember. And I was lucky. There's a group in Canada, Robbie. I don't think they even exist anymore. I think they're called the Collectors Archive, back when they did exist. Man, you could buy things from them that nobody else had. So I ordered the entire audio of the HSCA, all 52. I also got about a third of that on video from them as well. So that paid dividends when I was doing my book. I can send you the audio with one click of the mouse, because a friend of mine converted it from audio cassette to
MP3.
I'm sorry,
to MP3.
I think he did. I think that's what it was. And at some point today or tomorrow, I'll send that to you. In fact, I wanted my publisher in the book to put a code in my book that someone could type in, and if they type this code in, the audio would pop up. He wouldn't do it, but I think he said he might do it on the audio book. I don't know, but anyway, I can send that to you. It's fascinating to listen to. It really is.
It's I think the Warren Commission stated that Oswald was in his yard practicing by shooting tree leaves. And that comes from Marina. But then I've heard so much about Marina where it was like such a dysfunctional relationship that they had, where when she states in the HSCA she didn't care what he was doing, that's more of the Marina that I believe is the honest one, rather than compared to what the Warren Commission might have added in there. But there is something I don't know if you're going to know this, but I asked Blakey about it and he honestly couldn't remember. And I mean, you could say it's old age for sure. And it is kind of like a big question, but they had a safe at the HSCA. And some person had gone through that safe without wearing gloves. And it became a problem where Blakey had to have a dinner meeting. And look, Blakey had a lot of letters that are we need to discuss this with Blakey at a meeting at this, at this, at this. I believe that was like, we cannot give you these files because, and I don't think it's giant grand conspiracy. But I asked him in that interview, like before the latest record release, I said, do a lot of these relate to JM Wave? And then when the next record release happened a couple months later, it was all JM Wave, like mostly JM Wave documents. And I go, it's sensitive things that he might have, a name might have popped up that they are in the JFK files that just can't be released because it's a sensitive operation. So I'm not saying super conspiracy, but these meetings that happened, the safe that was gone through, did you ever come across that information about the safe?
I did not. I
Okay.
did not. Not a thing. I remember you talking to Blakey about that though, and I was unaware. I'm not surprised, of course, because I assume those kind of things happen, but I have no knowledge at all of that, nor did I have any documents that touched on it at all. Um,
I have a I'm trying to make a clip about it at some point, but when I asked him about the it was a janitor, but you need two sets of codes for those. One was for the CIA and one was for the HSCA that had the both codes to the safe. So that means they would have had to grab both codes. So I was wondering who it was. Blakey didn't know, but out of all the things the HSCA did do, in your mind, what sticks out as some of the things that either change what the official narrative was on certain things, besides the acoustics, but just certain little tidbits that the Warren Commission had that the HSCA proved didn't really either have evidence or was a big revelation that there was some new evidence emerging as it comes to, I mean, Warren Commission eliminated a getaway driver within a matter of like 48 hours, which was nuts.
right, right. Well, that's a good question. And I'm just thinking of all the witnesses in my book and what revelations they gave, or other people through depositions. You're right. The acoustics is the big thing. That's a horse that's been beaten a thousand times. I think it's an important difference to be sure, because the Warren Commission was totally unaware of it, as far as I know. I think there were things said in certain people's testimony that, had they taken it more seriously, like Governor Conley, maybe some things Robert Groden said, maybe some things that Cyril Weck said, that were revelatory. Um, but overall, in some ways, the more I worked on my book, the more disappointed I became with the HSCA, in the sense that they had a real opportunity here to really shed some light on some things, and they didn't. They just didn't. I wish that certain people would have been around in those days, like David Mantik, who's done the work with the X-rays and things like that. Who knows what a game changer that may have been. I think there were things that, but they were too busy playing defense to either, I don't want to say protect Oswald, but certainly protect the theory of Oswald. And they just did not seem to want to let anything get in the way of that. And that was really disappointing. I mean, Governor Conley, before the Warren Commission and before the HSCA, said the exact same thing. I heard the shot. Kennedy was hit. I was not hit. And his wife was there with him. She looked at Kennedy. He was hit. She realized her husband at that point was not hit. Well, that's a game changer. That eliminates the single bullet theory if what he said was true. They chose not to believe Governor Conley and his wife. And I think, with all due respect, that was a real blunder on their behalf. They were, who knows why people do what they do at the end of the day, but some of the people, the stances that they took, did they take them because they were regarding their positions, their pensions, their grant money? I don't know that at the end of the day. The Ida Dox thing is that's a fascinating story, though. I can tell you that.
Let's get into that one.
Oh, let me tell you. The reason that happened was by complete accident. I was looking at David Lipton's book, Best Evidence, and there was an exhibit F-302, which is the drawing of the brain by Ida Dox. But I noticed that she didn't sign it. And I thought that's odd because everything Ida did, she signed it at the bottom right. It says Dox, but not on the brain. Now, this isn't that big of a deal. It was just a minor point. But I thought, I need to maybe get a hold of her. I'm just curious. Why didn't she sign that one? She was the only person who drew anything for the HSCA. She had gotten a degree from Johns Hopkins University. I think at that point she was working for Georgetown, and she was recommended to the HSCA. I have some of her medical illustration books in my library, and she was phenomenal. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by that. But I just thought it was odd. And I actually reached out to David Lipton because it was in his book. And he wrote back saying, oh, she's just, a woman up in her years. You're making way too much out of this. To which I wrote back, I said, David, you're right. I may be, but I'm not trying to make anything out of it. I was just curious as to why she didn't sign because that picture of JFK's brain, while there is disruption to it, it's completely different than what you see on the X-ray, which is about a third of it missing. So something's wrong. I mean, that picture does not connect with any of the X-rays we have. But that's not why I called her. I just called her, hey, why didn't you sign it? So I called her up. I had a friend who had numbers at that day. He had phone numbers for everybody. And so I called her up on the phone. She lived in, of all places, Bethesda, Maryland. So I thought, okay, that's kind of strange. Doesn't mean anything. So I got her on the phone. And I said, Miss Dox, I said, I'm calling to ask you a couple of questions if you don't mind. I was very polite. She only was asked like 12, 13 questions, 14 at the most before the HSCA. She was in and out like a rat in a hole. Boom, see you later. And I had those right in front of me. And I started asking her the exact questions they asked her. And every single question I asked her, which was the exact question the HSCA asked her, she lied or changed it, one of the two, however you want to interpret it. And at one point I said, Ms. Dox, I feel like you think I'm trying to interrogate you. I'm not trying to trip you up. I'm about as sincere as you're going to find anybody probably is ever going to talk to you. Well, at that point, she goes, no one's ever talked to me. At that point, and I don't think anybody ever talked to her again. I probably spoiled that for the future, but anyway. And I said, Ms. Dox, everything you're telling me is at variance with what you said before the HSCA. And I said, I'm not saying you're lying. I said, I don't know. Maybe there's a reason why the answers are different. I don't know why. And so, but what she didn't know is before I called her on the phone, I requested every document with her name on it from the National Archives. And it was a stack, about that thick. It was a massive stack. And I mean, if she got a ham sandwich that day, I had the receipt for it. And her name is Ida Dox, but technically it was Ida Maloney because she had married a medical doctor by the name of John Maloney. And they paid her thousands of dollars. We're talking like $40,000 for like 6 months worth of work. But she told me the work was very, very tedious and very boring. And then I thought, well, but isn't that what you do for a living? Anyway, I didn't ask her that. But so she got very, very frustrated with me. At one point, she said, well, why don't you get a hold of Professor Blakey? I said, I have. I had interviewed him by that point. I said, Ms. Dox, it didn't really come up in our conversation with you because I didn't see there was any controversy. I said, I'm not sure there's a controversy now. I'm just curious why you didn't sign it. She goes, are you ready for this? She goes, I never drew a picture of the brain. I said, Ms. Dox, you were the only medical illustrator that they had. If it wasn't you, then I don't know who it was because you're the only one on record. And so I called Blakey because Blakey left an open door for me. Ever any questions, give me a call. He was still down at Notre Dame. So I did. I said, Professor Blakey, was she the only person that drew anything for the committee? He goes, absolutely, she was the only one. So that was it. But then she told me, she was, not only did I not sign it, I didn't draw it. I said, well, the brain is a problem, Miss Dox. I said, not that you're to be drug into that. I said, because that is a picture of a disrupted brain, but a third of it is not missing like it is in the X-ray. I said, that's a massive problem. So now we got the two brain problem. But I continued talking to her and she got so frustrated with me. She hung up on me and said, don't ever call me again. So I thought, man, I really didn't want this to end that way because I'm just asking a very easy question. I wasn't trying to be controversial, nothing. And I waited a couple of weeks and I called her again thinking, okay, this is not going to go well, but I'm going to give it more because I didn't want to leave on that kind of a note. We talked longer. There was always tension there, though. Even with the second call, we talked for quite a bit longer the second time around. She didn't hang up on me. At least we hung up pleasantly, so to speak. but she said, I did not draw a picture of a brain. She goes, I drew pictures as they wanted me to, is how she worded it. She goes, when I was in there in the room, I was never in the room with the originals by myself. There was always someone a guard in there with me. Okay, I didn't ask her that, but it was a little tidbit. That's okay. And she told me that she was told, I said, Miss Dox, I said, I have every document with your name on it. And in those documents, the following occurs. Notes back from Dr. Bodden, who is the head of the forensic pathology committee, with Andy Purdy, who's kind of the head of the medical, to present it. I said, and here's how they read. A note from Bodden to Purdy saying, we have to get pictures of gunshot wounds to Ida. Or they'd send a note to Ida saying, Ida, you can do better. I'm thinking, you can do better? You have the original autopsy photographs in front of you. You're a seasoned professional in your craft. How? I don't understand this. Let alone, why does she need pictures of gunshot wounds? She has the autopsy photographs in front of her. Well, then something happened that, I mean, the hair stood up on my arm, Robbie. This was the creepiest thing that happened to me in the entire JFK thing since I've been looking into it. Come to find out, Bodden, who was on the Clark panel in 1968, is kind of an underling. But at the end of the Clark panel, they got together and decided they're going to write a pathology book. I don't know if you ever looked at pathology books, but they are not what you want to be looking at as you're eating your breakfast. Oh my God, gunshot wounds, knife wounds, automobile wrecks, everything under the sun. They're really disgusting. And so I got a hold of that pathology book that Bodden had helped participate in the writing of it. And I looked at that so-called wound in JFK's colic area, the JFK that the HSCA made such a big deal of. They said, "Oh, that's the wound." The Warren Commission was wrong. In fact, they said that to Humes, like Dr. Humes, we have a problem. There's a 4-inch difference between our pathology panel and where you placed the wound, even though they weren't there, but Humes was. But okay, that aside. And so I said to Ida, I said, they gave you pictures of wounds. She goes, no, they didn't. Okay, Ida, I have the document right in front of me. And I talked to Dr. Bodden. He said, yes, we gave her pictures. He didn't deny it. He said, of course we gave her pictures of gunshot wounds. I said, why? He said, because we wanted her to enhance what was already there to show the public exactly where the wound was. Like, whoa, what's that about? And but as I'm looking through this pathology book, and I've looked at that so-called wound in the colic area, I turned the page, and guess what? There was that wound in the pathology book. You cannot mistake it. But it's not in the original autopsy negative. It's in the Ida Dox recreation of the back of the head photograph. Because there's two of them. There's the real, I call the real back of the head photograph, which looks like a little blood droplet up there, about 4 inches higher than where Humes placed the wound. But when Ida's done with it, yeah, it looks like a bullet wound, but it doesn't look like a bullet wound until Ida's done with it. And Dr. Bodden told me, because I asked him at WAC 2003, he said, did you do that? Did you have, and he didn't deny it. He said, absolutely we did. He said, because I wanted people to see where that wound was. I said, but if it was a wound, Dr. Bodden, you shouldn't have to enhance it. It should be a wound. It should be obvious it's a wound. He said, well, we wanted to enhance it. He dug his feet in. So that was, to me, that was a real turn for me, is that not only is there what I think a conspiracy to kill JFK, now there's a conspiracy to cover it up. Now you're messing with the evidence. You're admitting to me that you took pictures of gunshot wounds, gave them to Ida Dox, told her to superimpose it over what looks to be nothing more than a blood droplet in JFK's colic area, because you want a wound there. And I'm thinking, why do you want a wound there? Well, it was pretty obvious to me why he wants a wound there, because if you look at the autopsy photographs, there's this massive wound in JFK's temporal region of the skull. Well, if you move the wound up here, it makes it a little easier, does it? It's in shoot, out shoot. But it's kind of hard to make that wound come from a shot that hits Kennedy, slightly to the right of midline and 2.5 centimeters above the external occipital protuberance is where Hume puts it. Now, how do you get the wound going down and then pop out of the temporal area? So I understand why they did it. It just seems to be incredibly dishonest to me, is why you did that. So the phone call that began with, hey, Ida, why didn't you sign the brain picture, now has morphed into this massive problem. Ida had to know, to a certain degree, what was going on. She had to know that she was putting these gunshot wounds over places in JFK where there were not gunshot wounds. She had to know that, which means she's now committing perjury before the HSCAs. At that point, I just like, my God, this thing just blossomed rather quickly, just from, did you sign a picture of a brain, for goodness sakes? But I think that goes to show you that when you get into the weeds, there are certain times that you have to stay in the weeds because there is a lot of things going on in the weeds, so to speak. And with Ida Dox, it is absolutely clear that what was going on. And I feel sorry for Ida Dox. I don't think she had a choice. I think if Bodden or Andy Purdy or Flanagan or any of these people on the HSCA told her to do it, what is she going to say? No, I'm not going to do it. Of course she'll do it. And she shuts her mouth and never utters another word about it, and was not expecting Tim Smith to call her on the phone, I can assure you. And I'm sure I made her nervous, but I was not trying to make her nervous. And I said, Ida, just because you and I may be disagreeing right now, I'm not going to run out and call the New York Times. Hey, guess what? Ida Dox. But the fact of the matter is, just the Ida Dox testimony alone and those meager little 13 or 14 questions that they asked her, there is a embarrassment of riches, I think, concerning the assassination on what's going on, especially when you look at all the stuff that I got from National Archives, which has this conversation going back with Ida. Ida, you can do better. Ida, we need to get Ida pictures of gunshot wounds. That's just dirty, nasty. As I read, I just had I went into the bathroom real quick and take a nuclear shower to cleanse myself. It just seems so nasty to me. And I think there's something to it. I really do. So the Ida Dox thing, um, uh, I mean, I published that in a journal that came out in the 90s. There was a part one and a part two. And when I was done with it, I didn't think anything after that. After I talked to Ida Dox twice, I didn't realize that no one else had ever contacted her, but they had. No one else had ever talked to her. She's dead now, so no one's ever going to talk to her again. But I may have been the only researcher who ever talked to Ida Dox. Not that it's ain't that big of a deal. It's just it was by complete accident. I mean, complete accident. But it was disturbing looking at everything from the National Archives, been talking with her and talking to Dr. Bodden. And again, I like Dr. Bodden. Talk about a guy that's folksy. I mean, he's very firm on what he believes, but he'd be easy to have a conversation with. I don't know if he would talk to you on your program. I don't know why he wouldn't. He seemed to talk to everybody every other time, so why not? But the point being, he has never, for one iota, relinquished. Oswald did it. 2 shots from behind. That's it. And to him, is that game's over at that point. Okay, that's your position.
Do you think it's a super conspiratorial thing, or do you think it's just the fact that a lot of these people are trying to protect the government's reputation? Not just on a factor if they're connected in some sort to like, oh, I work for the government. Like, I mean, Blakey, he had what, Stokes or whoever go up to him and say, hey, try and keep these people's reputations like as they were when they were alive. I mean, you don't say that to someone who's investigating the government or anything of a conspiracy, especially if you want to get down to the base facts. But also at the same time, I mean, there's a big about American patriotism, which is like we got to care about. And look, it's not, I think you should be critical of your government, especially if you live here, especially if you are a patriot. And I think with a lot of this, it becomes to protecting the government's reputation in the eyes of the American people. And that becomes a problem when you are, I mean, a best example I could use is Dag Hammarskjöld's death has been investigated by the UN 9 times, and their newest conclusion is coming out at the end of July. But they're suspecting American involvement in his assassination of his plane going down. So when we look at the Kennedy assassination, you have to kind of be like, I need to know all the facts of the matter here. And it can't just because, oh, our government can't be involved in this, because we have to have people have faith in their government.
Right, I agree. There's times I say, I love my country, but I do not trust my government for 5 seconds. And I think what happens, you're called upon, to come to Capitol Hill, you're going to testify for the HSCA. I'm sure that's nerve-wracking, especially someone who never probably testified before any group of people. And this is our debut, before the government. That can be a little intimidating. I'm sure that was part of it, Robbie. I really do. I think you sit down. Do you really want to be the one to go toe to toe with these people and say, oh, no, that's not exactly, that would be very difficult to do for a lot of people. Easier for me, the Monday morning quarterback saying, well, why didn't you stand up? And, Ida, why didn't you say they gave you pictures of gunshot wounds to superimpose over something that wasn't there? That's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen. And it didn't happen. So, yeah, is it a super conspiratorial thing, like you say? I don't think you would have to have that big of a conspiracy to pull this off. Maybe a little bit bigger than what I once thought. But I guess even though in the book, I think I intimate that I think it was a military, maybe / CIA connection with what went down. But I've never been, and maybe I should be, but I've never been that interested in being right about that. Um, because if you told me, hey, Tim, I've got these documents, it proves the mafia did it, I'd go, okay. I mean, because I don't have, I'm not territorial in that regard. If I've come to find out that my little theory isn't right, okay, I don't, I'm more interested in looking at the evidence. And I think the evidence absolutely indicates that there was a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. Who did it? I I have my, theories. I'm looking at the mafia, not because I think they did it, although I did think they did it when I first started looking into it back in the '80s. Because for the most part, the only books I had were mafia books by David Scheim, who you've had on your program, and Blakey, who you've had on your program, and other people. I have good friends who know the case really, really well, that they're convinced to this day the mafia was behind it. So I don't know. I don't really see that at this point, but that's okay. Again, I'm not trying to make disciples. What I do try to do is look at the evidence. And that's what interests me. I want to look at the evidence. Where does the evidence lead me? And, that's where it leads me. And then at the end of the day, we can have dialogue and conversation like you like to have on your program. And yeah, that's what I'd like to do. So I don't think it needs to be a really big conspiracy, but somebody's handling somebody. That seems obvious to me. I mean, the Oswald phone call. I mean, are you kidding me? He has these numbers memorized, and they go to a guy, Hunt, in North Carolina, and the operator is told to tell Oswald, I couldn't put the number through. And we know that because as I duplicate that in my book, because the gal who was working with that operator dug it out of the trash can and kept it all these years. And that's how we anybody who has a copy of it, that's how they got a copy of it. And so we know that the call was made, and men in suits were there saying, do not put that call through. Tell Oswald that call. So, I mean, why is Oswald calling someone in North Carolina who is involved in military intelligence? I mean, come on. I mean, I'm not saying that solves the case, but you can't know that and not want to know more. That's for sure. So yeah, that's I think that's in the chapter on Joseph McNally, who's a handwriting expert, and I print that at the end of that chapter. But yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's just a damn interesting whodunit. It really is. I mean, it's fascinating. And I've heard you say this on your program. You think you're done with it, and all of a sudden, boom, there's another document that I mean, here you go again. It's like you can't resist it. So yeah,
I want to ask you about Humes, but I kind of want to ask about we talked about them protecting the federal government, but did you notice that they were at all critical on the Dallas police, especially when it came in particulars with mafia connections or just gang activity? I don't think gang activity has involvement in pulling off the assassination. I don't think the mob did it at all. I definitely think there's interesting connections to certain things when it comes to obviously the assassination plots on Castro. What documents Blakey was able to get was more in line with stuff that the church committee was already exposing. So then it seemed like the government was like, this isn't a big secret of ours. It's kind of known more now. But Jack Ruby's phone records, Bert Griffith, who stands with the whole, Oswald did it factor, still included that in his report. And that's pretty conspiratorial to the evidence the Warren Commission gave on Jack Ruby just being like a low-level mob guy.
right, yeah. Ruby is an interesting character. At times, I get frustrated with Ruby because I feel like he tells us nothing, and then other times I listen to him very carefully, and I'm going, okay, what's going on here? Yeah, he's an interesting character, to say the least. Um, the big controversy, of course, I think with Ruby is, does he walk down the ramp? How does he get into the Dallas, police station? That whole thing. Roy Vaughn swore to the, if I'm not sure Roy Vaughn's even alive anymore, but I've never heard Roy Vaughn say anything. And he was guarding the ramp. He said, I knew Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby never walked down this ramp. And I believe him. I don't think Jack Ruby ever walked down that ramp. The HSCA concluded that Sergeant Paul Dean let Ruby in on a side door. So that's big news, because Warren Commission never said that. I can assure you, Bert Griffin, in his recent book, he didn't say that. So yeah, Ruby is obviously let in for a particular reason. And I'm like you, at this point, I certainly don't think the mob is necessarily behind it, but certainly they were in cahoots with the CIA in a lot of different enterprises. So yeah, there's that. Ruby left his dog in his car, his little dog Sheba, and there was also several $1,000s in his car. that the IRS confiscated immediately because he was so far behind his taxes. He never saw that money again. So yeah, we know the Dallas police was corrupt. You've talked to Joseph McBride, some of the interviews that he's had with people. Yeah, they were corrupt. The guy who McBride interviewed it whipped out his KKK card because he infiltrated them or whatever the story is. Yeah, the Dallas police was corrupt, no question about that. All you have to do is watch what was the Thin Blue Line, and you see, what is his name? Gus Rose, who was involved with the Kennedy assassination. And he pretty much set this guy up to send him to the electric chair, and come to find out the guy was innocent. I read someplace that over 90% of every case that Henry Wade prosecuted was overturned. Okay, that's pretty telling. So yeah, I mean, it's a terrible environment that Kennedy drove into that day, no question about that. Exactly what that means, I talked to some Dallas policemen over the years. What was the one guy's name? Gerald Hill. He is a famous picture of him looking out, I think, the fifth floor window of the Texas School of Bus. That. And he sat with Oswald in the back seat when they arrested him in the Texas Theater. He was an interesting guy to say. He told me on the phone that day. He said, Jack Ruby, he says, now take me literally what I'm about to say. Jack Ruby was the kind of guy, if you bumped into him downtown Dallas, you said, Jack, that's a really nice shirt you're wearing today. He would literally take his shirt off right there and give it to you. Okay, I don't know exactly what that means, but he said, yeah, everybody knew who Jack Ruby was. He was a common guy in Dallas, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so I think, is there a revelation that the HSCA puts out on the whole Ruby thing? Yeah, Paul Dean let him in a side door. What else do you need? I mean, Paul Dean had to do it because he was told to do that. He didn't wake up one day and said, if Ruby stops by today, we'll let him in for a little look-see. I don't think it happened that way. So yeah. So the Ruby character in some ways is frustrating for me because I'm never sure, what's really going on with Ruby. I mean, the Warren Commission produced, I don't know how many pages, Robbie, of the lie detector test that Ruby took, and he had the little squiggles. But you have no idea what they mean. They're just squiggles on a page. It goes on for page after page after page. It'd be nice if you just told me what those squiggles mean and interpret them for me, but they never do. Just squiggles on a page. So that's a little bizarre. And of course, you've done with the whole Jolly West thing, and that's a can of worms as well. So yeah, so there's that.
What about Humes did you find that you thought was important?
Oh, Humes, that was that chapter of the book was first an article that was published in a journal in the 90s. And then I think Jim DiGino put it on his website a few years ago. I had just gotten the ARRB depositions of Humes and all the medical people. But at that point, the only thing I had was Warren Commission, HSCA, and then now I have the ARB. So I sat down and I did a comparative analysis of his three testimonies. It was troubling to say the least, because in 1964, Hume says, and I quote, the wound in the back of John Kennedy's head, as I said earlier, was slightly to the right of midline and 2.5 centimeters above the external occipital protuberance. That's it. In 1978, he arrives on the scene, and as he's being interviewed, I think by Gary Cornwall, if I'm not mistaken, Cornwall says, the pathology committee, Dr. Humes, has a problem with where you place the entrance wound in John Kennedy's head. They think it's in the colic area, which, by the way, is where Baden has Ida superimposed the wound that I don't think is there. And Humes, you can tell Humes is troubled by this. I have the video. He's shaking. It's like, he goes, I would have trouble with that. But he finally throws in the towel. So now we have a problem. In 1964, the wound is low in the back of the head, but now, 14 years later, that wound has morphed 10 centimeters, approximately 4 inches. Now it's in the colic area. Well, first of all, Humes, you were there that night. You had, you helped take the brain, along with Paul O'Connor, out of Kennedy's head. You helped the mortician, Tom Robinson, piece his head back together for the casket viewing. Not very many people. I'm sure Jackie and Robert was the only people who opened that casket, but that's beside the point. So it isn't like Humes wouldn't have known where this wound was, but now all of a sudden you have a panel 14 years later saying, we weren't there, you were, but we know more than you about where the wound was. That just seems bizarre to me. Possible? Of course, anything's possible in this, as you know. But then before the ARRB, he testifies, and Jeremy Gunn, I think, did a really good job for the ARB. He would ask questions, and if people didn't know, they could seek clarification. He would reword it. He was very, I think, amenable to them. So in 64, the wound is down here. In 78, the wound moves 4 inches. In 1996, Humes, before Jeremy Gunn, says, I have no idea where the wound was at. Like, what? You don't know where the wound? Now you went here, here? I don't know. But then he writes a letter to the ARB after that, saying, I've had some time to think about it. I'm going with my 1964 conclusion about the external occipital protuberance. So Humes is all over the place when it comes to the. I had a friend of mine who befriended Humes in the 90s. And she was deceitful about it. I won't name her name, but she was deceitful about it. She was acting like, oh, I really like you. Seem like a nice guy. And he bought her an umbrella and everything. And then he found out she was a Kennedy assassination researcher. And apparently he blew his top. They never talked again. And I don't know if she got anything out of him or not. None that I ever heard of, any great revelations. But yeah, the Humes testimony is disturbing because he doesn't seem to know where the wound is, for goodness sakes. And I don't know how you don't know that. I mean, he was a medical doctor. I'm assuming he's taking classes in anatomy, for goodness sakes. He knows how to use a metric ruler to measure things, and yet he seems really troubled before the HSCA. And if there was anyone, there's 2 people I felt sorry for: Ida Dox and, believe it or not, Dr. Humes, because they really went after Humes. And what I discovered with my National Archives retrieval with Ida Dox and with the stuff with Humes was that they interviewed everybody ahead of time. When these people testified before them, that was not the first time they testified. They had already gone over every question they were going to be asked by the people ahead of time. And maybe I was just naive, but I was shocked when I discovered that with Ida Dox. I said, are you kidding me? So I asked Blakey about that. I said, did you go over these questions with people ahead of time? He says, every single one of them. They knew everything that they were going to be asked before we asked them. Okay.
So when they state that they don't know, they had time to prepare and think about it.
Absolutely, they did. Every single witness was talked to by an HSCA staffer before they ever appeared before that public committee.
It's like when Blakey asked me, he's like, yeah, I don't remember. If you would have sent me some questions ahead of time, I was like, I know, I'm sorry. But in my head, I'm thinking, if I would have asked you about the venereal disease document, you would have not done the show.
You're right. You're probably right about that. Yeah. So I'm with you. I think the most recent one, the HSCA, kind of trumps the Warren Commission in that regard. I agree. And I think things were discovered by the HSCA that we would not have known without them. And you can say the same thing about the ARB. We now know things because the ARB that we wouldn't have known had we stopped with the HSCA. So it goes onward.
I don't know if you know this about Humes, but I'm sure you do. But he burned his preliminary draft in his fireplace because he didn't want the blood on his draft to be objects of mere speculation. But do you think he took Pierre Fink's notes?
If I was a betting man, I would say yes to that. I would say yes to that.
Fink stated someone took his notes, and that's the only person. If he's got a track record already of burning one set of notes, why wouldn't he just burn Fink's?
Exactly. And Boswell and Humes are Navy people. This is Bethesda Naval Hospital. Fink is an Army guy, so he's a little out of his element there. And I think that Humes is guarding the fort, as it were. I really do. A lot of things about that are that whole autopsy thing is really bizarre in so many ways. I mean, I was tempted this morning to bring. I actually have the styrofoam like wig thing, that people wore, and what was the guy's name? Paul O'Connor drew on that styrofoam thing exactly. Remember, Paul O'Connor took the brain out of Kennedy's skull, and he wrote exactly where the wounds were, signed it, and everything. And it's what you have heard everyone say the autopsy pictures look like. The problem with the autopsy pictures is that the back of the head doesn't look like what 98% of them say was there. I mean, when I talked to Crenshaw in 1998 when I was in Dallas, I said, Dr. Crenshaw, I know you've been asked this question many times, but I just want to hear it. When you looked at the back of John Kennedy's head, I'm assuming you did. He said, yes, I did. I said, what did you see? He said, a hole big enough I could have put my fist inside. He said, and after they pronounced him dead, I went back in a second time because I never wanted to forget what that looked like. He goes, yeah, the hole was big enough I could have stuck my fist inside. No question about it. But I don't know if you've seen the Paramount Plus, what the doctor saw documentary. They're all saying the same thing. And then you have Baden come on at their end and goes, they were wrong. What? They were wrong? I mean, what would be their motivation at this point in their lives? There's no motivation to lie at this point. So do I believe that? Yeah, I think there was a hole in the back of his head. How do I explain the back of the head autopsy photograph, which doesn't show that? Although I will tell you, if you look at that photograph stereoscopically with 3D glasses on and two very closely taken pictures, they can't be the same picture, that'd be a little different. You will see things there that just look odd. I mean, especially if you look at that photograph in color, his head is soaking wet, except where the wound supposedly was, dry as a bone. And my wife, who works in the salon industry, I showed her, she goes, that something's wrong. She goes, why is his head so dry there, but it's soaking wet every other place? And then there's times when I'm talking on the JFK, I'll give talks at local libraries, and I will show that picture, and I will say to people, who is that? They'll say, it was JFK. I said, how do you know that? You can't see his face. You don't know that's JFK. Now, do I think it's JFK? Yes, I do think it's JFK. But you can't. But I mean, we just assume a lot of things in this case. I think sometimes we assume things too quickly. But yeah, I think if I don't like to scream fake evidence. That bothers me because if the evidence is fake, there's nothing to talk about because we're talking about fake evidence. But that back of the head photograph, something is wrong with that. There's just too many people at the autopsy and at Bethesda, at Parkland, who said there was a hole in the back of his head. What are the odds that they're all wrong? I mean, to me, it's just that stretches credulity to the breaking point for me. So yeah, I think there is something wrong with that, and I think Mantic has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, to my mind, that there was tampering done with those X-rays. Absolutely. So somebody's covering the fort again here. Conspiracy to do it, conspiracy to cover it up. So,
I want
and
to
it's
ask
disturbing.
I want to ask about Howard Brennan's statements. Have you seen how many times that guy has given in like an interview or a report? There's like 6 reports with the FBI. Then there's like, and they all are different. There's a little bit each time after a couple months, something gets added onto the bottom of it where I'm like, you just remembered that out of nowhere? You're getting better memory compared to when you were first interviewed.
Yeah, Brennan's a problem because he is the star witness for the Warren Commission, and that's embarrassing. And I asked Blakey about that. Blakey said, "Oh, he said I never would have had Howard Brennan testify." He said that guy is a nightmare. The problem is, and here's where the Warren Commission just simply was not honest. When you look at the Zapruder film, you see Brennan sitting on those reflecting pools with a little cement thing there, and he is facing. It would be east. He's facing east and he's not even looking. I mean, at one point he turns and he looks over his shoulder, but at no point is he looking up into the Texas School Book Depository. If you watch that film from start to finish, and yet in the reenactment, what does the Warren Commission do? They move Brennan. They don't have him sit there anymore. They have him move him over to where he's looking right into the doorway north of the Texas School Book Depository. Well, I'm sorry, he's not sitting where he was. So but you had, in fact, but even who was it? I think it was David Bellin who was cross-examining Brennan, and he said, shouldn't I'm paraphrasing, shouldn't I see your legs dangling over the edge if you're sitting where you were in that and Brennan says, yeah, and then they changed the subject. But I think at that point, Bellin realized, oh my God, this is a nightmare because he's not sitting in the Zapruder film where he was in the Warren Commission reenactment. But they had to move him because if you don't move Brennan, you can't have Brennan looking in the window. You don't have Brennan looking in the window. You don't have him identifying Oswald, even though he didn't identify Oswald in any of the lineups. And when asked about that, he said, "Well, I was scared because I didn't want, my family was in jeopardy and blah 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 blah." But Brennan's just a pathological liar. He does write a book. I don't know if you're aware of that, called "Eyewitness to History," and it's written by his pastor at the time, but published posthumously. Um, Probably a good move because that thing is chock full of more lies than you can imagine. In that book, he says something to the effect that when he went to Washington, Earl Warren asked him if he'd like to meet Jackie Kennedy. He's like, that didn't happen. I mean, just stop. You're just making this up as you go. Now you're embarrassing yourself. But yeah, Brennan is a massive, massive problem. Every time he opens his mouth, things change, like you say, and like you say, his memory gets better the more you talk. Well, it doesn't usually work that way. Yeah, Brent, and when I asked that to Blakey, Blakey flat out told me, like I said, he said I never ever would have had him testify. He goes, that guy is all over the map and about as reliable as the weather, for obvious reasons. Yeah. And I think I published those pictures of that in my book, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but yeah, Brennan's a nightmare. And so a lot of the people who testified were a nightmare, not just Brennan. Jack White was a nightmare. Jack White was an embarrassment. So
Why did Blakey have a problem with Jack White?
Blake had a problem with Jack White because Jack White did not know what he was talking about. He claimed to be a photographic expert. He had worked in graphic design, but he was not a photographic expert. He didn't really have access to any original negatives or original photographs he was working with, and he embarrassed himself in the process. And it was kind of sad. I met Jack White a couple of times, didn't really know him, but he was the type of guy, and I don't like to go all negative on people, but I got the impression sometimes with Jack White that he would find a conspiracy under every shingle of every roof in the country. And that if there's a conspiracy everywhere, then there's a conspiracy nowhere. And Jack White was one of the 52 that I didn't spend a lot of time on. I mean, I read his whole testimony, of course, and analyzed what he said, but they went after him because he had no credentials either. I mean, he had no credentials at all to justify the statements he was making. And remember Blakey's thing, this is a scientific inquiry. And so to put Jack White on there, and it's not just Jack White. By going after Jack White, he's going after other things, because if you impugn Jack White, you impugn other things as well, because other people would agree with Jack White. But even though that's true, Blakey said, I wish I would not have put him on, because that was a mistake. It was just embarrassing to listen to.
Did you ever ask Blakey, or did you ever get any feelings about certain members of the HSCA that you feel like were in a position that we're just going to stick with the narrative? I mean, you already mentioned Bodden, but besides Blakey, but any other ones that had more, not nefarious, I want to say, but just more focused viewpoints when it came to this is the conclusion that's going to stay intact and we're not going to investigate these possible angles? Then which do you feel like Richard Sprague is a good example, but we're actually out there trying to look for the truth of what the American public either needs, believes, whatever. But Downing, I mean, he's a good example of a name. I think he was initially going out there for some good. I think he became a little bit more disconnected from it, and everything else revolved around other members of the committee to do the
That
work.
is true. I would say one guy that comes to mind, though there was more than one. There were 9 people who testified before the Warren Commission that are part of the 52 that testified before the HSCA. So I'm just thinking about that. Approximately 1/5 of the people that gave public testimony had already testified on behalf of the Warren Commission. So that's a little, that's just 20% of the people talking have already, what they're going to say. They're all in. Larry Sturtevant, he was a ballistics guy, and here's the hypocrisy at times of the HSCA. When Cyril Wecht testified, whenever he went off of anything medical and started talking about the Zapruder film, they would ask him, well, Dr. Wecht, are you a photographic expert? Well, no. Are you a ballistics expert? No, I'm a forensic pathologist. He goes, well, then just stick to forensic pathology. But other people did that. They got carte blanche. Larry Sturtevant did it, who was a ballistics expert at Aberdeen Proving Ground. When he talked about the Zapruder film, oh, go right ahead, Larry, talk about the Zapruder film all you want. We won't challenge you. But they did Wecht, so why didn't they? And that happened on more than one occasion. People who were pro Warren Commission and pro wherever the HSC wanted to go, they would just let them go wherever they wanted to. I mean, take what's his name, Charles Petty, who was the 10th person to testify for the HSCA, a forensic pathologist. He actually had worked with Bodden in New York City before the committee ever got together, so they knew each other. They're probably friends. Who knows? He mentions Dr. Wecht's name 10 times. They only asked him 10 questions. He mentions Wecht's name 10 times. Obviously, his purpose there was to prove Wecht wrong or whatever Wecht had said before, because he testified after Wecht. And I think he testified who was before him. It was, I think it was not him. I think it was Bodden, then Wecht, then Petty, if I'm not mistaken. So Wecht was sandwiched. That's not conspiratorial because they were just grouped together because they were on the forensic pathology panel. But obviously, Petty was there to disprove Wecht. That's the only reason he was there. He mentions Wecht 10 times in 10 questions. That's ridiculous. So, but Wecht, he's not allowed to go outside the boundaries. Oh no, you know anything about photography? Don't you dare mention this Zapruder film. which I'm not sure how you can't mention it, but I mean, how many autopsies did Cyril Wecht do in the course of his life before he recently passed away? What, 15,000? I mean, I'm sure he knows something about bullets by this point, for goodness sakes. So yeah, they were a little hypocritical when it came to that. There were some who towed the party line, to be sure, and even Conley's fun to listen to, and I think he absolutely disproves the single bullet theory by his own testimony. But at the end of the day, guess what? He still believes Oswald did it alone, and he still believes the single bullet theory. So okay, they're walking contradictions in the effort to territorial guard the turf, and that's kind of sad to see.
I want to ask you about Wecht, only because he did pass away recently, but a lot of lone nut people, specific names I'm not going to name, but they wrote articles about Wecht was lost by conspiracies, and that it was really the conspiracy community that made him have these stances on this, and he didn't actually believe this, but he felt like he was stuck, which is not true. And I think if you've ever, like you mentioned, you've ate with him and you've been able to talk with him. I mean, he's one of the first, in my opinion, to really kind of. I talked to him briefly. I mean, for 30 minutes, I have an unreleased podcast with him. I will not be releasing it. There's clips with him about it. It's only because I happened to come at this a little bit too late in the game. His speech wasn't the best, and I just thought it would be better to keep his reputation intact if I just did clips with him. But great man I mean, we had a good discussion off air and on air. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on him, and then obviously his passing, but also people coming out and saying that, he never actually believed any of this conspiracy stuff. And it's like, seems like, how are you just going to rewrite all the work that he did for all those years speaking
Nonsense,
out?
absolute nonsense. If there was one person on planet Earth, if you want to know what he believed, and if he's going to be honest with you, it was Cyril Wecht. I mean, he was just a straight shooter. He didn't care. He was about as kind of a gentleman that I've ever met, to be honest with you. But when you bring up the Kennedy assassination, he was always all in. Um, uh, he was so encouraging to me. I mean, I felt like a fish on the water when I was there in 2003 at the conference, but he was so supportive of not just me, but everyone there, even people that disagree with. But he was a no nonsense kind of a guy too. I mean, he was never going to compromise what he believed. He has never written anything that I know of, or he's ever said anything that I've ever listened to, where anyone could ever come to the conclusion that it was anything except he believes they were a conspiracy. And to the point that the local government of Pennsylvania went after him and had charged him with like 80 some counts of everything from malfeasance to who knows what the charge. And of course, at the end of the day, guess what? After they darn near bankrupted him, then they drop all the charges. So obviously, if Cyril Wecht was going to toe the line, that would have been the time to do it, and he didn't at all. So no, he was a consummate gentleman. He was a serious researcher, especially when it comes to the medical stuff, obviously. And he knew his stuff, and he would challenge people and ask them questions, and they couldn't answer him. He no, I don't know how anyone could ever get that out of Cyril Wecht. He was I know when COPA was first starting, the Coalition on Political Assassinations, and there was an early meeting when they were getting together, and they didn't have any funds. And I remember him writing a check, $5,000 right there. Boom, here you go. Let's get this going. And he was just very serious about it. I mean, early on, early 1960s, right after the issuing of the War Report, he gave a talk at Academy of Forensic Sciences or whatever one of those were, and he was kind of and guess who was there in the audience? Pierre Fink, and he knew Pierre Fink, and he gave this presentation on the problems with the medical evidence in the Warren Commission. So no, from day one, he was a very pleasant and yet voracious voice on behalf there was conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. No question about that. There are some. There's one guy who I don't know if you're familiar with Vincent Salandria. Yeah, he said something early on. He talked in 1998. He gave the keynote at the COPA in Dallas, and he said that night. He said, "Look, people, you may disagree with me. I believe there was conspiracy, but I'm sorry, this is a false mystery. There's no mystery to this." He says, "You should have known on day one almost what was going on," and he wrote articles. And I think there is a book that has most of his articles in called A False Mystery. the stuff he said in reference to the single bullet theory, where he just absolutely obliterates it, still hold up to this day. And that was without anything that you and I would know that he wouldn't have known then. I mean, that early on, he was writing things that just demolished it. And interesting factoid here, he met with Arlen Specter later on, late in life, and Specter told him to his face, he said, yeah, he said, you demolished the single bullet theory. He conceded to him. Now, that's not ever going to be said publicly, as you well know, but behind the scenes, he told Slandria, absolutely. He said, the single bullet theory has officially been destroyed by you, referring to Salandria. Salandria's book, A False Mystery, and there's another book where he has correspondence with another guy that's probably 400 or 500 pages, is worth its weight in gold, my friend. Holy smoke, there's some good stuff going on there. There's a lot of good stuff out there, though. There really is. There's not a drought for reading material for people like you and I, no matter what your position is. So, yeah, it was sad. I knew Cyril Wecht was sick. I knew he wasn't doing well. I'd seen pictures at the 2023 conference out there, and he did not look well. Then obviously he passed away, and that's a blow, because I mean, honestly, young people besides you, Robbie, I'm serious. I can't think of one person your age that's interested in the case. Not one besides you.
Give me a little bit of liquor and get my friends around me. I'll be talking JFK all day. Let me tell you something.
Exactly. So,
I'm gonna kind of hit a wrapping point here because you've given me enough of your time, but I want to know what you're hoping to spread, or at least put the message out there with your book, and then also where can people find it as well too.
it is on Amazon. It's also on eBay. And it's I think technically it's in like Barnes and Noble and Target, though I've never seen it there, but supposedly it's there. But anyway, you can get it off Amazon. I think I wanted to do something that no one had done. I wanted to create a guide. And if you pick up my book, you want to know what the people who testified and they represented what the HSCA said happened, you'll get that from the book. And I also try to update the evidence through the year 2022, which was important to me as well. So yeah, though, in that sense, I'm not very good at touting my own stuff. I just don't do that. But I do think it's a book that I put a lot of time in. There's a lot of information there. And if people disagree with it, that's fine. Let's have a conversation, like you say. But they'll know what the HSCA stood for and what some of the pushback is maybe against that as well. So hopefully, if things go right, I can do the RFK as well.
Yes. Please let me know if you need some help with that or anything. If you need Craig or anybody, I can send you their contact info. They're more than happy to help.
Sure.
I'm sure.
Did you want to maybe talk off?
Yes, we will.
Camera when we're done.
Yeah,
it's something I want to share with you. So,
thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode.